We want to look back at some of the top Canadian legal stories of 2019. From the courtroom to the court of public opinion, these issues dominated the headlines. And to help me, I'm joined by Toronto criminal lawyer Monte MacGregor. Good to have you in studio, Monte.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
I want to begin with a case, a difficult case, that sparked so much anger and shock and disbelief in some areas. St. Michael's College School became embroiled in scandal last fall when allegations of group sexual assaults and bullying came to light. In total, 7 youths were charged in connection with the allegations, and in court this year, 3 ended up pleading guilty, including one of them pleading guilty to a charge of making child pornography. Monty, what stood out for you in this particular case?
I think what stands out, sadly, is that it seems like even in your school, you can't be protected. And I think that's, I don't mean to be flippant about that or simplistic about it, but this is one of the most recognized and well-regarded schools in Toronto. It's certainly recognized nationally. And to have a level of bullying of this level, I think it's sadly become a common occurrence in schools, and especially at this level where it involves horrific sexual assaults that have impacted the victims in such a negative way, probably for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And then the questions start to come about is like, what can you do to stop this? Who's responsible? And then for me, what's come out of it on the legal side is obviously there are criminal prosecutions that are associated with it, and people have been found guilty. And now there will be a civil suit to try and hopefully compensate the victims in some form.
It was hazing on a whole other horrific level, and it sort of opened up a conversation surrounding that. But it also talked about the people who stood around and the one who filmed it, and that led to a charge of distributing child pornography.
That's correct. If you take videos in any regard in a sexual manner for someone that's under the age of 18, then you are subject to that. And that often happens in sexual assault cases with minors, is that if somebody videotapes it, even in an odd situation where you have a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old that are technically dating, and one films the other in a sexual act, it can be, if they send it to their friends, it can be the case. And it looked like that was a part of the bullying, was to try and, unfortunately, put this on social media after it occurred.
And part of the trauma, obviously, that will be addressed. And the dissemination of this in today's youth where, you know, they all have videos and Snapchats and TikTok. And so it just opened up a discussion about how one has to be so careful about what one does with their phones.
Well, cyberbullying is such a common occurrence now, and it's almost more powerful than just relying on somebody being physically violent with a youth, because it can destroy their reputation and ruin them almost for their entire future.
Yeah. Let's talk about two other court cases that also made headlines, in part because the accused pleaded guilty. Let's start with Bruce MacArthur. The evidence around this case was overwhelming. Was that part of the reason why he pled guilty, in your opinion?
It is. This was a very telling case for me, because the thing about being a regular participant in the justice system is that you get a sense that the general public has somewhat of a distaste. They feel that the justice system in Canada somewhat fails them. And this is a case that, for me, was somewhat of an example of that, because I remember when I came on CTV to speak about it extensively, I had a pretty clear understanding of what was going to happen to Mr. MacArthur. Given the number and nature of crimes that he had committed, I'm quite confident that he will never see the light of day and never get out of jail. And there was a significant question about what his parole eligibility would be. And so what I found odd is that when you'd speak to the average layperson, they're shocked that he only received a period of 25 years, which is standard for one conviction for first-degree murder. And obviously he was guilty of 8, I believe it was. And people expected him to get the 200- and 300-year sentence that you hear about in the United States.
Right.
And what they fail to recognize is that it's a life sentence. There's no way the National Parole Board will ever let him out. And it's somewhat sad. I think it leaves a sad taste in the mouth of the LGBTQ community in Toronto, because they had issues with the police and whether or not they were properly protected. Was this allowed to go on? But in the end, to me, the way I see it is that society was saved from having a massive trial on a horrific case. And it harkens back to Bernardo, where you think of the Mahafian French family who had to go to court to try and prevent people from distributing what happened in that case. And the MacArthur, because he pled guilty with some of the most well-regarded people in our justice system in the city of Toronto, that was prevented. So that, to me, is a victory.
In a similar vein, but obviously a completely different story, the driver of the tractor-trailer truck that struck the bus of the Humboldt Broncos, he also pled guilty, sparing the families in some ways.
And that's also very telling of just the quality of the justice system in Canada, where you have somebody that it wasn't an accident. He clearly was legally responsible. He missed what was an oversized stop sign and drove through an intersection. And the ramifications nobody would ever anticipate would happen. 16 dead people, 13 seriously injured. And it was a fightable case. And I think that's what people need to understand, is that given the nature of the roadway, when you have crash reconstruction experts, there's certainly would have been a chance for him to fight that case. But instead, he takes accountability, and that's a significant step in our justice system. And many people, again, don't understand how he would only get an 8-year sentence, but you have to balance out the nature of the offense and the nature of the offender. You have someone that's he's an immigrant to Canada from India. He will be deported after this is over, and he steps up and says, you know, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. There's nothing we can do but punish me, and I'll take responsibility for what I've done.
Right, but it's still not enough for the families that lost.
90 victim impact statements at that, and it was the repercussions felt all across Canada and even in the United States, where people were, I remember putting out hockey sticks to try and commemorate the loss.
Oh, yes.
Just an incredible case.
Still do. The wrongful conviction of Glenn Assoon, he was finally exonerated after spending 17 years in prison. My gosh, what that must be like.
And that's the other balance of the justice system. That's where you see it failing somebody, because a lot of times as a defense lawyer, people ask you, well, how can you defend that person if you know he's guilty? And you always say that, I always say that I'm their voice, I'm not their judge, and we'll let the system determine that. And what you see in the Assoon case is an absolute, catastrophic miscarriage of justice, where police officers get tunnel vision, and despite the fact that they had evidence and information that had originally shown that he wasn't a target, completely disregarded. There's a potential for either an intentional or inadvertent destruction of evidence. And how do you give that man back his life? How do you recompensate him for the years where his liberty is completely taken from him?
We just have a few, not even 30 seconds left to talk about pot legalization. You know, it was one of the top stories of 2018. How did it fare in 2019?
Well, it's funny because they've expanded, I gather, now to allow derivative products and edibles to be available. It seems that the one real problem that they're having is figuring out how to administer this system, because they're still challenged to try and figure out how to cover the supply, how to cover who's allowed to provide it. I mean, there's still concerns. People are still getting charged because it allows for possession but not trafficking, so you can have a small amount. And of course, they've implemented, the pardon system to try and allow people that have been convicted before. That's also problematic because it's time-consuming, very difficult because you have to pay hundreds of dollars to have it happen. So that is, I'm glad that that's happened, because I think that was what society required, and there's no point in punishing somebody for something that's really not a crime, but it's problematic still.
I'm sure we'll continue to hear about it in 2020. Monte MacGregor, thank you for looking back at 2019 with me. Appreciate it. You're watching CTV News Channel.